Legier, and I'm the Senior Manager of Public and Community Engagement at ICS. And as you may know, the ICS Health Equity Speaker Series, it's a virtual event that is hosted by the Science Office to share theories and practices around using race and related data that we have here at ICS. So we're actually relaunching the series. We had a little bit of a brief hiatus, and now we're going to be relaunching with kind of these fall sessions that are a bit more focused on specific data holdings at ICS. We did have one earlier in the year already on the IRCC data, and now we're resuming today with a focus on the Ontario Marginalization Index, including an overview and some key changes to the 2021 version, key context and considerations, and I'll be presenting a case study on how we actually use this index with our ICS Public Advisory Council. I'll now hand it to Elise, who will kindly open us with a land acknowledgement today and introduce our two terrific presenters that we have joining us. Thanks, Elise.
Thanks so much, Laura, and thanks everyone for joining. Let me pull up the screen here. What you're looking at first is a sneak preview of a map tool for the Ontario Marginalization Index and its area level subdivisions, which Trevor is going to kindly delve into more for us later today. But before we do, I'd just like to lay over kind of a completely different way of how we can also understand this land. So long before the arrival of settlers, this land was stewarded by many Indigenous nations. Myself, I'm a settler. I grew up in Treaty 6 territory, much farther north and much farther west of where I live and work today. And since moving to the Toronto area a few years ago, I've been striving to learn more about this land and its history. And truly, every time I learn something new, it deepens my realization of how little I really know. The area that I call home today is the ancestral land of Wendat nations and was maintained as Wendat hunting territory for many, many years, and also the territory of their Anishinaabe allies. Nearby rival Haudenosaunee nations also hold claim in these territories, and these groups negotiated peace together in a dish with one spoon. Haudenosaunee historian Rick Hill states that I think we did invite the settlers to come and take from the dish too, but with the understanding that there are these laws, that you only take what you need, you always leave something in the dish for other people, and you keep the dish clean. So if you, like me, are a settler, I urge you to take this note today as a reminder that we are treaty people, to consider the privilege we enjoy by virtue of being able to live, work, and play on these lands, and to also consider how we can better uphold our end of the treaty promises, taking only what we need, caring for the land, leaving some for the future, and doing our part overall to ensure that life continues for all those on these lands, stewarded now and since time immemorial by the many nations of Wendat, Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, and other Indigenous peoples. So with that, I'm pleased to introduce today's speakers. We'll be hearing first from Dr. Flora Matheson, who is the Unity Health Toronto Chair in Homelessness, Housing, and Health. She's a sociologist leading the Justice and Equity Lab located at the MAP Center for Urban Health Solutions and an associate professor at Dalalana. Situated at the intersection of health and social sciences, her program of research is the culmination of 20 years of sociological work on gender, justice, and social structural inequities. Her research is embedded in the community and engages people with lived expertise and service providers who support these communities, and has an explicit practice and policy orientation aimed at improving lives. We'll also hear from Trevor Van Ingen, who is an epidemiologist lead in the Informatics Department at Public Health Ontario. His work focuses on advancing the reporting systems for population health inequities, including the development of updates to the Ontario Marginalization Index that we are specifically here to talk about today. And we're also joined by Laura Ferreira-Leger, our own Senior Manager in Public and Community Engagement and Knowledge Translation here at ICES. So thank you all so much for being with us and sharing your expertise with us today. I'll pass it over to Dr. Matheson.
Great. Thank you, Elise, for that. And it's a pleasure to be here to talk to you today about On-Marg. And maybe you can just, Elise is going to have to move my slides for me because I don't seem to have any control today. So thank you. This is the outline slide. So my objectives today are to briefly provide an overview of the Ontario Marginalization Index. I'm going to describe the community consultation regarding the naming of the dimensions, and I'll talk briefly about the new dimension names. So let's start with what On-Marg is. If you go to the next slide, Elise, please. We typically describe ON-Marg as a set of 4 separate indices that describe area level marginalization. These 4 indices allow us to explore differences in equity or inequity across census geographies, like dissemination areas or Toronto neighborhoods. People have historically used these indices to explore both social behavioral outcomes, like rates of smoking, and health outcomes, like depression and rates of emergency department use. Next slide, Elise, please. We're often asked to talk about the origin story of ON-Marg. And the origin story really began with the sister index, which is the Canadian Marginalization Index. And CanMarg originated back in 2002 during my postdoctoral studies. And at that time, a group of us was interested in creating an index that would reflect very complex nature of marginalization and inequities across Canada. So some of us, being sociologists, were already familiar with such concepts like social disorganization, segregation, material and social deprivation, social class, occupational prestige, the Gini coefficient, the Carstairs and Townsend indexes. But we wanted to have a more comprehensive list of all of these historical concepts as a theoretical framework or basis for our analysis. So we did a concept review of the literature to identify these constructs of marginalization and inequities. And we located approximately 60 conceptual domains with about 180 or so underlying indicators associated with these concepts. So this became the framework for our analysis. So next slide, please, Elise. So once these concepts were identified, we then said, okay, so what do we have for data sources? And the only one that was sufficiently comprehensive was the census at that point in time. With that, we decided, we then cross-referenced the indicators from our concept review with what was available in the census data. And we found that we were able to create 42 variables from the census data that would align with the measures from the concept review. We then conducted factor analysis, and this resulted in the 4 dimensions that we know today. And you can go to the next slide, Elise, please. So these dimensions are a linear combination of the 18 variables derived from the factor analysis and that independently explain the greatest possible variance in the data. Each dimension, as you know, is a separate index with a standardized score, and the indices are available as factor scores and as quintiles. And all of this information is explained in greater detail in the user guide. And this is available both on the Public Health Ontario website and on the Ontario Community Health Profiles Partnership website. If you go to the next slide, please. When we first designed CanMarg, we engaged an advisory committee to support the work. So this was back in 2002 or so. We consulted the committee as we did the analysis and to help name the dimensions. And 20 years ago, that committee found it very challenging to name the dimensions, to select names that would reflect strengths-focused language. Since then, we've received lots of feedback on the dimension names from people within our own organizations and from users, external users. We've also had many discussions about the names ourselves. And when we produced the 2016 version of CanMarg, we again consulted with our partners on its dimension names. Through that process, we changed CanMarg names in an effort to reduce the deficit-focused language and move towards strength-based language. Then when we created the 2021 ON-Marg, both Trevor and the PHO folks and our team at MAP reached out to our partners again to ask their advice on new names for the ON-Marg dimensions. And again, we wanted to move away from the deficit-focused language and move towards strengths-based language. So using a survey, we contacted approximately 25 people who'd used the index and asked them their thoughts about renaming the dimensions. And since we've done the renaming process with CanMarg, we provided those new dimension names as a starting point in the survey. for the potential new ON-Marg dimension names. And we asked people if they liked the CanMarg names or if they would recommend an alternate name for each dimension. And then from this process, we now have the new names for the Ontario marginalization dimensions. So let's take a look. So the next slide, please, Elise. So households and dwellings was previously residential instability. And this dimension reflects concepts related to community cohesiveness or incohesiveness. So cohesive neighborhoods can promote resiliency, positive mental health, and well-being. Next slide, please. Material resources. This was previously material deprivation. This reflects concepts related to socioeconomic status and access or lack of access to necessities like food, housing, and education. And then age and labor force, which was previously dependency. Next slide, Elise, please. This dimension reflects concepts such as economic vitality of communities and how resources are allocated to ensure, for example, that people with disabilities or seniors have access to appropriate resources that enable their well-being. We can also think about what structural and systemic factors create barriers to well-being based on age, area level age, and labor force inequities. And then if we look at the last dimension, which is racialized and newcomer populations, this was previously ethnic concentration. This dimension reflects newcomers or non-white, non-Indigenous populations. It relates to the impacts of racialization and xenophobia. We know that racialized groups experience differential treatment on the basis of race, ethnicity, language, religion, and or culture. The change in title of this dimension is critical given the history of structural and systemic racism in Canada. And so those are our new dimension names, which came through our consultation. I just want to add one more final thought before we move to Trevor and Laura. I know that Trevor and Laura will be speaking more directly to these points, but I want to briefly say that when we use ON-Marg and we think of its use, it's important to consider the communities that are affected by these structural inequities and understand from their perspective what the data means to them and how the findings should be framed. It's important to have these conversations early and engage early in the research. So the research includes their voices and reflects their lived experience. I know that I work hard to do this in my own research with patient and community partners. So I just wanted to say that before I ended my part of the conversation. So thank you very much for listening, and I'll pass it over to you, Trevor.
Great. Thanks, Laura. I believe, Elise, you're bringing up the slides. All right, thank you very much. Okay, yes, so you can skip to the next slide, at least. For my part, I'll be focusing on some of the key considerations to keep in mind when using ON-Marg. I'll have a quick note on geographies, some considerations for avoiding unintended harms, and general limitations on the index. Next slide, please. So I'm going to assume that this is an audience which doesn't need a lot of description on the uses of ON-Marg, and you may have already used it or you have projects in mind. This figure here is just an example of some COVID-19 cases, and it represents a fairly typical example of using ON-Marg to disaggregate some health outcome that contains postal code into quintile groups to better understand how the trends in health vary across different levels of marginalization. So this example, we're using the material resources dimension, which was called neighborhood material deprivation at the time, and it's just showing the stepwise grading of higher rates of COVID-19 in the more materially deprived neighborhoods. Although there's this highlight here where this is the period just following the Omicron wave in 2022 when that gradient is actually reversed. So there's some value here in using it to monitor inequities over time. Another use case of ON-Marg, which is often used as research, is to use the factor scores themselves as a variable in a statistical model and then to interpret the parameter estimates. However, I'd like to spend more time talking about the actual considerations. So next slide, please. So for whatever your analysis, we recommend that you use ON-Marg at the dissemination area level or the DA level. So DAs are the smallest geographic area available, and they're designed to have an average population of 400 to 700 people. We've provided ON-Marg at larger geographies as well. However, the larger the geography, the less homogeneous the population within that area is. And the less the on-marg value represents the experiences of all individuals within that area. So you can think of how problematic it is to assume that everyone in Toronto would experience the same level of marginalization as represented by the average score for the whole city. I'll be getting into this aspect a little more in a few slides. But for now, I also want to mention that the scores and quintiles can be derived for custom geographies as well, as long as they're based on DAs. So the Ontario Community Health Profile Partnership has been deriving ON-Marg for a number of neighborhood geographies, so including the City of Toronto, for Ottawa, and some Ontario health regions. I believe now they're up to around 70, they have neighborhoods for around 70% of the Ontario population, which is, I think, pretty neat. And next slide, please. Thank you. So moving on to some limitations. The first one I would like to mention is that ON-Marg is based on the census. So this has two major limitations associated with it. So one is that it's only refreshed every 5 years. And really by the time Statistics Canada releases the census, it's already somewhat out of date. So timeliness can be a challenge. And the second is that not everyone is counted in the census. So for example, there's data suppression of Indigenous reserves, as well as some serious undercounting of Indigenous populations living off reserve, i.e. urban Indigenous populations. Other populations are not targeted by the long-form census, and this includes temporary foreign agricultural workers and people living in congregate settings, such as long-term care homes and correctional facilities. So these populations are not counted in the census, and so they're not reflected in the index scores. And so this is something to consider when using ON-Marg with a health outcome that is really strongly associated with certain population groups, such as COVID-19 and its increased burden among long-term care home residents. And so when a variable that makes up ON-Marg is suppressed in the census for a given DA, we can't produce an ON-Marg score for that area. So this impact is felt fairly unevenly across the province. And this map here it shows the proportion of DAs within each public health unit where there's a missing ON-Marg score. And so most PHUs have well under 5% of their DAs impacted. But for the North, and especially Northwestern Public Health Unit, this issue is a bit more severe. And so this should be taken into consideration when applying ON-Marg in a more local area. Next slide, please. Second limitation is around the difficulties in interpreting multifaceted and area level constructs. So the index dimensions provide a comprehensive measure of socio-demographic marginalization. And this is important because of intersecting and layered and the complex ways that social determinants of health impact people. However, there is a risk that by using an aggregate measure, you could mask some of the variation in the individual components that may be more strongly associated with a health outcome of interest. So interpretation can sometimes be a challenge in this respect. Secondly, research has shown that area level measures may be describing the impact of neighborhood level effects that can be acting independently of individual level factors. And so an example of this is research showing that the CCHS survey respondents have low agreement between their area level and individual level measures of low income, but that similar socioeconomic gradients in health can be described using both measures. So this indicates that even though an individual may not be low income, living in a low income neighborhood still has similar negative impacts on their health. And finally, I'll mention that ON-Marg, despite its name, doesn't address all forms of marginalization. And so, for example, Black populations, Indigenous populations, women, lots of population groups experience marginalization in ways that may not be captured by the index. And so, you should consider alternative methodologies for describing health inequities in these specific populations. And next slide, please. All right, so I mentioned earlier, but a third limitation is related to problems with ecological fallacy. So I assume most of you know this is a highly technical audience. Ecological fallacy is something that can occur when you assign the overall characteristics of the entire population to individuals within that population. And so some people within a neighborhood are not going to be represented by the neighborhood average. And so they may be misclassified as if ON-Marg is used as a proxy for individual level socioeconomic status. I mentioned that this problem can be worse at larger levels of geography as populations there are more heterogeneous. But it's also something to consider when using the DA level quintiles. So this is a table showing characteristics of DAs across 5 quintiles of the material resources dimension. And so first thing I'll mention is that the population totals are different. And so it's important to adjust for population size, either using rates in your results or including offsets, population offsets in your models. In bold here is the average value of the DAs, and minimum and maximums of the DAs in that quintile are in brackets. And so what you'll see is that as a group, DAs within each quintile increase in the proportion of the census variable, as you might expect. So the low marginalization DAs have less low income than the high marginalization DAs. However, though, you can see that there's a wide degree of variation of the DAs within each quintile. So as an example, there are DAs in Q1, so low marginalization, that have up to 31% of the population earning less than the low income measure. While at the same time, there are DAs in Q5, which is high marginalization, where 0% of the population is low income. And so again, this is a consideration when thinking about individuals and how to apply ON-Marg to them, is that there's a wide range of experiences, and there can be some danger in just assuming that this will work as a proxy for individual level status. Next slide, please. So lastly, I want to discuss that health equity analyses, by describing health statuses of specific communities, runs the risk of perpetuating harms through stigmatization, through the reinforcing of negative stereotypes about those communities. So at the same time, understanding and measuring inequities is an important step in addressing those inequities. So as much as possible, we want to try and reduce and mitigate this risk of stigmatization. One way to do this is to ensure that analyses are grounded in an appropriate and respectful approach, is by articulating the purpose and especially how that these analyses can be used to benefit the communities. Another important mitigation technique is to recognize that the inequities being described by ON-Marg are driven by underlying social and structural factors. So providing context which highlights the roles of these factors and ongoing historical structures, policies, and practices can ensure that the results are not being misinterpreted in a way that may stigmatize populations. So the descriptions that Flora mentioned and that are in the ON-Marg user guide are provided for this very reason. And I would encourage users to think about ways in which you can add this context to your reporting so that it better highlights the structural factors that are driving some of the inequities that are being described, including racism and poverty. And lastly, as Flora mentioned, it's very important to incorporate the perspectives of impacted communities. This helps provide important context, but it also really strengthens the relevance of your results. I'm hoping Laura can provide some more examples of how at ICS researchers are thinking about how to do this, but I want to mention that even where it's not possible or feasible to directly engage with communities, you should be finding other ways of including their voices, either through incorporating existing literature, frameworks, or knowledge. And then for my next slide, yes, I'll be sharing my screen, so hopefully someone can let me know if this isn't working.
Looks good. Thanks, Trevor.
Perfect. So I just wanted to do a quick demo of our map tool just to kind of tie in some of the points that I've been talking about. So this tool is available on our website, on the Public Health Ontario Ontario Marginalization Index website page. And it's a DA level interactive map where, as most basic, the darker shades represent DAs with higher level of marginalization. You'll notice that on the left-hand side, we provided descriptions of the dimensions, and which include a mention of the underlying structural determinants. So this is the one way in which we're providing that additional context. You'll notice that using DAs also gives you a perspective of the heterogeneity of the neighborhoods within a larger geography like the city of Toronto. And so using larger geographies, you lose some of this variability, and that can, decrease your power, but also impacts, the accuracy basically of your result. Another feature of our map, I'll just mention, I won't show it really right now, but you can switch between the different map layers, which show the different dimensions of the ON-Marg, but I'm just going to stick with the material resources right now. This box over here allows you to select health units, which if we go to Halton, will zoom into that health unit and then populate these graphs on the side, which describe the distribution of the DAs within that area. There we go. I'm sure this would be a bit faster if I wasn't also casting and doing all kinds of things. So yeah, and so one thing I'll just mention about this is that often when you're using ON-Marg at a sub-provincial level, you run into these situations where the quintiles are not evenly distributed within that area. So Halton is a very, relatively wealthy health unit, and so there are quite a few DAs which are in the low marginalization and very few which are in the high marginalization menu or high side of the scale. So if an analyst or someone in Halton region wants to look at the, compare the top 20% and bottom 20% of their population, it's possible to reweight the index so that using the DA level scores so that the quintiles can then reflect an even distribution of ON-Marg values within that area. So we find sometimes that these locally weighted DAs are useful for specific kind of analyses. And I'll just jump to one more health unit to show. So if we go to Northwestern, as I mentioned before, Northwestern has this issue where quite a number of the DAs are suppressed or not available in the census. So you can see here, this is 81 DAs. It's quite a significant amount, and so any research that is looking specifically at Northwestern, although they have a small population, relative to all of Ontario, there is going to be that impact of the missing DAs, and so other analyses maybe could be more appropriate, or other techniques for accounting for these missing populations. Right, so I'm going to try to get out of this screen share now. And I'm happy to hand it over to Laura for her part.
Great, thank you so much, Flora and Trevor. I'm going to share my screen and I'll open up my slide deck here. Great. So now that we've had that great overview from Flora and Trevor just about thinking of the Ontario Marginalization Index in some important contexts, I'll give you a little bit of an example application that we used with our ICS Public Advisory Council. So I'll provide a little bit of an overview of the project itself, how really we use the ON-Marg in the project, and then some lessons learned with the PAC on communicating to the public. And I will say there's been definitely a lot of overlap between what you highlighted, Flora, and what you highlighted, Trevor. So it's nice to see there's a lot of alignment here in things that you've considered as well. So the public-led analysis project really kind of began with really the onset of the Public Advisory Council back in 2019. In some of the original objectives of their terms of reference, one of the key kind of goals or objectives that they wanted to fulfill was to actually create an ARC project. And for those of you not familiar with the ARC program, an ARC project, or Applied Health Research Question, is a question posed typically by an organization to obtain research and analytics that really help inform their planning and program development. It's funded by the Ministry of Health, and this was kind of the first time that the PAC had been involved in something like this. And when I say PAC, I'm just referring to the Public Advisory Council. So education and background was provided to the group, really trying to decide on a topic and a research question between 2021 and 2022. And really, we completed the analysis last year, and we're just at the tail end of this project now. We're creating some final products. They should actually be released within the next few months, and we'll be excited to kind of share the results and really the process that was involved with this project. I just wanted to take a moment as well to acknowledge all the hard work of many, many folks who've been on the Public Advisory Council over the past few years. The council does operate on a staggered membership where we recruit new members every 18 months. So that's why there is quite a few names here. And again, it kind of dates back to that first cohort that really identified this as a priority for them and something that they wanted to be involved in. So a really big thanks to all the members, past and present. Now, I won't go too deep into this, as actually this is a little plug for a report that will be coming out, but I did want to highlight some of the approaches that we used kind of concurrently throughout the process when we did something like this, really kind of an analysis project with the public. So just to highlight a few quick things here, we definitely want to focus on education and guidance throughout this project process. A lot of folks have never really worked with data before, didn't have, maybe even an understanding of what we had at ICS. So there was a lot of training sessions we used, helping folks kind of land on a potential topic or research question that was of interest to them. And this was kind of ongoing throughout the process. We also did a lot of shared and guided brainstorming, including idea generation sessions, and really open forums as well to make sure that we could help answer their questions. All the stages also involve some sense of consensus building, either live or after a meeting with surveys. And we tried to ensure, again, that we did this in a way that all folks felt that their voices were heard. And finally, feedback and evaluation was really important. Throughout this process, and as you'll see me talk a little bit about later, we did learn a lot of lessons throughout doing this work, and it was helpful for us to kind of gather that informally throughout the project. So the PAC with the Applied Health Research Question team at ICS, as well as the Mental Health and Addictions team, worked together to better understand the following questions using ICS data. As ultimately the PAC landed on a kind of mental health and addictions related topic area, these were the questions that they wanted to answer. So where did Ontarians seek services for mental health and addictions, and what were their reasons for visiting? Did mental health service use change over time? And does mental health service use differ depending on income or where people live? I also wanted to take a moment to highlight a big thank you to Mike Campitelli and Luis Palma for all their work on this analysis, along with Paul Kurdiak, Michael Patterson, and all the MHA and ARC teams more broadly. They're really involved in this from onset to completion, so a lot of folks have been involved in kind of getting this work to where it is today. So in terms of our study period and population, another thing the PAC expressed interest in is they didn't necessarily want this to be a pandemic project, but they did want it to encapsulate a little bit of how this might have looked during the pandemic. So our period was April 2012 to March 2022. And we looked at mental health and addiction related outpatient and emergency department visits quarterly. So we had about 40 total quarters in the study. We also looked at Ontario residents from birth to 105 who were alive and eligible to receive healthcare services in Ontario during that time, and residents with no contact with the healthcare system in the past 8 years were removed. So another thing that the PAC really highlighted is this interest in sociodemographic characteristics. It was something that was really important for them to explore. Some folks did have direct experience with the mental health services, personally or with family. So again, they were very interested in kind of exploring deeper into what this might look like for different folks. So for the last quarter in our study period, which is that January to March 2022, this is really where we kind of zoomed in and looked at and stratified mental health and addictions related doctor visits, outpatient physician visits, and emergency department visit rates by neighborhood income quintile, region of residence, and then all the dimensions of the Ontario Marginalization Index. So to quantify differences in mental health and addictions related physician and emergency department visits, within each of the sociodemographic characteristics, we use rate ratios to compare the visit rate for those in the highest quintile of a factor with the rate of those in the lowest. And each analysis was conducted for all mental health and addiction related visits and separately for each diagnostic category. So in other words, reason for visiting. I did want to note two key things. So Number one, there are many other factors beyond those reviewed in this project that can influence mental health service use, including how severe the mental health challenge is and what service is closest to someone. We looked at each factor or characteristic in isolation and did not examine the interaction between these or other factors. So just two important limitations to note when you're looking at these results. So I think some of the most interesting findings that came out of this project were from one of the dimensions of the Ontario Marginalization Index. And obviously I won't get into all the results today, just given our time constraints. But again, I encourage you to take a look at our full report when it does come out. But two key findings I wanted to highlight here is the household and dwellings dimension from the Ontario Marginalization Index. And as a reminder, as Flora mentioned, the household and dwellings looks at the types and density of residential accommodation, as well as certain characteristics of family structure. So in this graph, you're looking at the mental health and addiction outpatient visits. And you're kind of looking across these different reasons for visiting. So you can see that on the x-axis. And then you're looking at the lowest level of instability, quintile 1, all the way to the highest in quintile 5. So what we found was that people living in the neighborhoods with the least stable housing made 70% more doctor visits for mental health and addiction related issues compared to people living in neighborhoods with the most stable housing, specifically in that winter 2022 period. So as a reminder, that January to March 2022. This increase, as you can kind of see there, was mostly driven by mood and anxiety disorders, which is by far the most common reason for mental health and addiction related physician visit or outpatient visit. We did find this difference was actually much greater than the differences observed when comparing the highest versus lowest quintile of material resources or the lowest versus highest quintile of neighborhood income. So things looked a little bit different in the emergency department. So here we're still looking at household and dwellings, but now we're looking at mental health and addiction related emergency department visits for that same study period. So that winter 2022 period. And again, you're looking across the different reasons for visiting and the lowest to highest quintile. So the impact of unstable housing on visits to the emergency departments was similar to the impact on material resources, like these looked very similar. And people were actually 3 times more likely to visit the emergency department for mental health and addiction related issues if they lived in neighborhoods with the least stable housing situations, as we can see here. So what we found kind of more generally or overall is the findings from this analysis really supported much of the existing literature that recognizes the connection between a lot of these characteristics or social factors and mental health and addiction service use. Our findings did highlight the existing inequities in mental health service use, which anecdotally we did hear from our PAC members as well. So what they kind of saw in the results did echo a lot of what we heard from them as well. The other thing I wanted to highlight is that, as I alluded to, we have a full report that'll kind of outline the process and the results. But the PAC also wanted a results video that was in plain language, that could be more easily digestible by a public audience, and that had some of these key findings for folks to look at. And again, we do highlight these same results on housing situation from the Ontario Marginalization Index in that video, and this will be coming out shortly as well. So a few things to note on using the Ontario Marginalization Index that we kind of took away from this project. So as Flora alluded to, there was community consultations that happened in 2021 and name changes to some of the dimensions in the ON-Marg, or all of the dimensions actually. And it's important to note that our PAC actually saw the old names. So before the data came into ICS and was integrated, we actually were reviewing the former names. But interestingly, and again, shows a lot of alignment, is that our PAC kind of had similar thoughts and kind of recommendations to what was heard in the community consultations and what ultimately ended up being changed. So again, they kind of highlighted avoiding problem-based language and just really clarifying the measures. So it was great to see that happen as well. And we're able to kind of use those new names now in the report going forward. The other thing that I just kind of wanted to highlight as well is some of our approaches to explaining the Ontario Marginalization Index to the public. So as I mentioned, not all of our PAC members know about data or kind of work in research or data. Some folks are really wearing kind of or coming at this from a public perspective. So during our results presentations to the PAC, we used plain language to describe the measures and what they were seeing. You can see a little snippet of this here. This is just an example of one of the slides we used. And it wasn't just for the ON-Marg. We used kind of similar plain language to talk about rate ratio, to talk about what a quintile was, and just kind of breaking these things down in terms that they could understand. The other thing is that we used existing YouTube videos that explain, what's a bar graph or a line graph to kind of help people. So when we show them these things, they can also understand what it is that they're looking at and better kind of take away the key messages from looking at the ON-Marg dimensions. So we also found that that was pretty helpful. So after we learned some new ways to explain the Ontario marginalization to the PAC, we also tried to summarize some of the feedback we heard from the PAC throughout the process. So one of those was that the PAC felt that the measure of racialized and newcomer populations, for this specific project, it may miss unique nuances of each community. So for example, immigrant communities may have a different experience from Black communities in mental health service use. But we know that the Ontario marginalization is a really important measure of neighborhood level marginalization. So we wanted to put together something that could potentially contextualize the data for public audiences and describe some of the things that really the PAC put forward and that we took away from the project. And this is something we're kind of putting together now in a memo. We're hoping to actually also release that soon internally, just so, again, if you're looking to use this index in some of your projects, you can think about the ways or things that might help for presenting it to a public audience. And again, it's very interesting. There's a lot of overlap in what we've already heard in the presentation today as well. So to kind of conclude, I'll just briefly summarize some of the recommendations that we took away. And again, a lot of these are echoed in the user guide already. So we're kind of just putting everything all in one place internally for folks. And again, I would say that most of these recommendations are in relation to the racialized and newcomer populations dimension, but some of these are likely also applicable across all the dimensions. So the three key takeaways is number one, to use or consider using specific language and data labels. So PAC members recognize that it's really important to highlight that racialized populations and newcomers experience racism, discrimination, and marginalization. But they didn't want the data labels to ever classify folks as inherently lesser. So we also you could think about contextualizing the quintiles. So consider even using, instead of most and least marginalized, you could consider just explaining what it is that the public is looking at. So we often use neighborhoods with the most / least racialized and newcomer populations. So very specific labels that folks know what it is that they're seeing. Also just being transparent about the data source. So as we already heard, the data source is census-based and not individual level data. And it's just important to kind of remind your audience of that and that it reflects neighborhood level marginalization. You could also consider, again, not using the dimension to summarize the experiences of one entire community or to make kind of large inferences that could harm or stigmatize certain communities in any way. So again, as we kind of, Flora alluded to this as well, you may want to wish to consider engaging specific populations in your study to help better understand the neighborhood level experiences that you're seeing in the data. And again, our office here at ICS can always help you with that as well. And finally, contextualization when applicable. So contextualization can help to kind of proactively prevent anyone from making assumptions or causes about what they're seeing. And again, I think Flora alluded to this point too, is just considering why you're using the index and how it can be used to name health inequities and or racism. So again, even considering including like a 1 to 2 liner, just contextualizing and accompanying your results in graphs, especially if you're referring to the racialized and newcomer populations dimension. So with that, I'll stop sharing my screen as we do have a little bit of time actually for some Q&A. So I'll just come back to the main screen here and just see, folks can type in the chat. I think Elise already also shared a link to a Menti if people want to ask their questions anonymously. And I actually see some questions already coming in. So let me take a look at these.
Yeah, we've had lots of questions come in, so clearly shows the great interest in this topic, and thank you all again. I wonder if we can open with one that came in through the Menti when it was circulated in advance with the calendar invitation. Someone was asking, I mean, folks spoke to this a little bit already, but just giving you the opportunity to build on. When using aggregate equity data, such as data from ON-Marg, how do we do community consultations here, given that the audience and the relevant lived experience is potentially very diverse. Laura, I think you've highlighted very well this particular example that we did with our Public Advisory Council, which is, of course, very diverse. So anything you wanted to build on there, or Trevor, if you wanted to speak about some of those other strategies you mentioned. I see Astrid mentions in the chat also including a qualitative arm of the project in the project design from the get-go can be another way to incorporate community perspectives, but we'll just open the floor if anyone wanted to build on that.
Laura, do you?
Yeah, I mean, go ahead, Trevor, if there's anything you want to add
Okay,
first.
I'll just say quickly, a lot of my work is more like operational surveillance in nature, and it's very difficult. There isn't really the similar kind of community group at PHO that exists that Laura was describing here at ICES. So it's a challenge for us. It's also something too that, we have students come in who want to include on-margin in their analysis, and it's not feasible for them to go and do a novel community consultation, right? It's just there's lots of ways in which, it's difficult to do. So rather than not do it at all, that's why we're trying to highlight looking at the literature, and some of the literature, I think I'm drawing a blank right now. I think it's the EGAP framework, the Black Health Equity Groups. There's lots of literature around highlighting some of the things that we mentioned around, contextualizing and doing some of those other things. So even if you can't directly engage with that community because it's not feasible, being able to pull in what's been written already is really important. Laura, yeah, hopefully you have something a bit more specific.
Actually, Michael, I don't know if you wanted to add on this or if you had a separate question. I see your hand.
It's a separate question, so we can continue with this answer.
Sure. Yeah, no, thank you so much, Trevor. And I think, there's a lot of resources also we provide internally, but I think the important thing to always remember is, is it going to be feasible for your project? And is it something that you can fulfill meaningfully? Because I think at times, there may be, a rush to engage communities or maybe kind of an afterthought. But really the strength, and I think the strength that came in this project I spoke to was that it was kind of integrated throughout the process. So from the onset all the way to completion, we considered how we could do that. So I think, again, there's different resources that we have in-house, but I think first and foremost, just considering, do you have, budget and resources to do this appropriately? Is it going to make sense for your project? And how can you kind of build it in a way that's really incorporating this throughout the project? And Flora, I don't know if you want to add as well.
Yeah, maybe I can just say, I mean, I think when I think thinking about the purpose, why are you asking the question, and who should be at the table when you're asking the question, and then how can you engage, and can you engage the right people when you're asking the question, and if you can't, then are you the right group to ask that question? I think those are important things to think about when you're starting a research project. And I think engaging people early on in the research process is really important. It's not always easy to do, and it does take time. And sometimes we are rushed, but I think it's really important to think about those things at the very beginning.
Thanks so much, Laura. Michael, did you want to ask your question?
Yeah, thank you. So first of all, thank you very much, Flora and Trevor. Great presentation, and Laura, and really important work. I think the renaming, the reframing that you've done helps us to think about these types of factors in different ways and in more, I think, in more ethical ways, more responsible ways. But I wondered whether there was any discussion about changing the term marginalization itself for the overall index, because, to me, now that you got me thinking about it, marginalized from what? I mean, essentially, it's kind of a gaze from a center, and presumably the dominant group of the population, looking out at the margins of these people who are living on the margins. And if I'm living on the margins, that's my center, and I'm looking back on this dominant community or group and so on. So I don't know whether that even came up, or whether you've thought about that, or whether there are alternatives that have been discussed. But I just wondered your take on that.
It did come up, because once we did the name changes, I think I mean, for me, then I was thinking, okay, so we changed the dimension names, but it's still called marginalization. And so there's still deficit-based language there. And then what do we do about that? And I think, Trevor, I even may have said it to you. And then I wasn't quite sure what to do with that. So if anyone has ideas, we'd be very open to hearing those. But I've been thinking about that as well, and what to call the overall index, because we're still left with, yes, we want to change the dimension names to more strength-based language, but we still have the overall dimension name with the term marginalization in it. And so we're left with that. So yes, it has come up. I don't have a solution yet.
No, that's great. I mean, it's just an interesting discussion, and good to hear that you're open perhaps for suggestions. Maybe we can do some brainstorming collectively on this.
Great, thanks so much, Michael. I see, maybe Elise, we'll go to the questions in the chat first. So there's a question for the team. I think this is for Trevor and Flora. So it says, given the important limitations Trevor highlighted related to census data and who may or may not be counted, recognizing the challenges with census data and that folks may not trust the system given past ongoing harms, have there been any discussions around developing alternate methods or strategies that work to incorporate these populations rather than continuing to exclude them given the available data?
Do you want to take first stab at that, Trevor?
Sure. So I think a lot of this question is related to how do you work with Indigenous populations. I personally believe that it's probably taking a more like Indigenous health specific lens is probably the better tack to using, to studying health inequities in Indigenous populations. And that includes, thinking about like the OCAP principles and doing much more deliberate consultation and engagement, using all, individual level data sources where you have Indigenous identifiers. Those kind of strategies provide a much more appropriate and probably a better, stronger approach for studying health inequities in those populations. But also there's lots of examples. In COVID, we were looking at outbreaks among migrant worker populations in congregate housing. So there's a group that, in a very non-diverse area, you had outbreaks of migrant workers basically. So using individual level data where you can, I think is probably the only real way to know for sure who you're measuring, and then thinking about alternative ways to properly discuss and report on those results.
And I would add consultations with Indigenous groups to seek out their ideas on how best to develop data sources that are more appropriate, because I don't think the census is really the best approach.
I think that mostly answers, there's a second question that said, what do you recommend for missing on-marg values in analysis? Looks like deleting missing values will delete Indigenous population data. Can it be assigned any specific quintile? I think you kind of touched on that.
I think, yeah, usually we do not include those in the quintile results. There's also other ways in which we have missing data too. Often there's poor postal code data, or or if there's postal code, it doesn't get matched through PCCF. So there's all kinds of ways in which you end up with missing populations. I think it's just important to document why people are missing because there's no on-marg value versus poor data quality, like those kind of things. But yeah, generally, if you're really interested in that population, I think there's more specific and focused approaches to talking about and studying those groups.
Thank you all so much. A couple other questions that had come in from the Menti. One person is asking, if you don't have enough data to separate participants into quintiles, do you have any suggestions on how to merge quintiles? For example, comparing the lowest quintile with the rest of the quintiles.
Yeah, I suppose so. I mean, there's other ways of, you can use the scores in a model, and that will give you a little more power. But then, it's harder to interpret that for a lay audience. I think I have seen it done comparing the lowest to the rest, but the rest group is quite large and heterogeneous too. So that also can be tricky. I'm sorry, there's not like a great answer, or maybe
And some people have used the two highest, the middle, and the two lowest. So there are different ways of collapsing the quintiles.
Thanks so much. Maybe we can do this as a bit of a rapid fire and try to get through all these questions. Maybe I'll throw this one out to Flora. Someone's wondering, can you speak a bit more to the specific social theories that informed the development of the index?
Boy, that's going back a ways. I think one of the ones that really interested me was social disorganization theory from the Chicago School, which would be related to households, and what was originally residential instability would be households and dwellings now, which was really around the inner city neighborhoods and the disorganization of those neighborhoods and how that led to distress and disorder. And there were theories around graffiti and things like that. So that was one of the theories that was driving some of my work in my graduate work and my postdoctoral work. So that would be one example. And then there were quite a few other ones, but that's one example.
Thank you. I see you've got another question in the chat, and the questions are still coming in. I see we're also at time. Do we want to wrap up here, and maybe we can try to get the rest of the questions answered and circulate the answers with the recordings, or do we want to? Yeah, does that sound good?
It's fine.
Yeah, that sounds excellent. Thank you so much, everyone. There seems like there's a lot of interest in this topic, so we'll try to get to these questions and follow up with those. But a big thank you to Trevor and Flora. Thank you so much. As you can see, there's a lot of interest, so really appreciate your time in this session. Two last really quick housekeeping notes. If you want to continue the conversation, we still actually have spots open for our Ask Me Anything sessions with Dr. Arjuman Siddiqui on October 23rd. So you can still sign up for those. And our next speaker series will be on November 4th on surnames, and we'll focus on the recent changes to controlled use. So thank you all again for joining us. I hope the session was valuable, and have a great afternoon.